Uh, this is a part of the Kerala State Higher Education Council sponsored Studies in Dissent and Protest lecture series uh, organized by St. Thomas College, Thrissur, Kerala, India. And this is 17th May 2022, the second lecture by eminent scholar and professor Vinay Lal. The lecture is entitled Globalizing Protest, a New Architecture of Street Dissent. Those who are not able to join the Zoom meeting, they can definitely join the YouTube live video in which you can chat to, you can send questions and we will answer. And for a formal welcome, may I invite Dr. M.J. Viju, faculty, postgraduate and research department of English, St. Thomas College. Dr. M.J. Viju.
Good morning to all. Thank you, Viju sir. His Excellency Martoni Nilangadil, Manager of St. Thomas College, Thrissur. Honorable Resource Person of the Day, Professor Vinay Lal from University of California, Los Angeles, USA. Authorities of Kerala State Higher Education Council. Our most respectful principal, Reverend Dr. Martin K.A. Dr. Andrew Thomas HOD, Research and PG Department of English. Dr. C.S. Biju, Dean of International Affairs and Coordinator of the Erudite Lecture Series. Dear colleagues of English Department, Deans, faculty, research scholars and students from our college as well as from various institutions in India and abroad. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of Kerala State Higher Education Council Erudite Lecture Series on the topic Studies in Dissent and Protest in collaboration with the Faculty of International Affairs and the Research and the Postgraduate Department of English, St. Thomas College Autonomous, Thrissur. First of all, on behalf of organizers, let me welcome cordially His Excellency Martoni Nilangavi, the manager of the college, who has consulted us to join online on this erudite lecture, as he himself inaugurated this lecture series on 10th May 2022. Our resource person of the day, Professor Vinay Lal, is the professor in History and Asian American Studies, UCLA, Los Angeles, who was introduced well by our HOD Dr. Andrew Thomas during his first lecture on the topic, The Perfect Exponent of Satyagraha, Propaganda and Army of Nonviolent Resistors, which was scheduled on 10th May 2022. I am so delighted to say that internationally acclaimed Professor Vinay Lal is with us today to speak on the topic, Globalizing Protest, a New Architecture of Street Dissent. Roland Blaker, Professor of International Politics at the University of Queensland, says in his work, The Politics of Change, Why Global Democracy Needs Dissent. Because in democracies, dissent is all too often seen as a dangerous force that undermines stability, order, and the rule of the law. He further states, because of the process of the globalization increasingly undermines the traditional realm of democratic participation, citizens' daily lives are influenced by political, financial, and cultural forces that transgress state boundaries. People in all parts of the world, whether it is in Ukraine or in Sri Lanka or in India, should have a saying how the related issues are addressed, but many global institutions or international organizations and multinational companies are neither transparent nor accountable to democratic public, which leads to globalizing protests in the streets in all over the world. As a person who is keenly observing world politics all around the world and who has taught history in UCLA, Professor Vinay Lal is a very active person available today to discuss this topic in detail. And I am so happy to welcome and introduce such an international figure who doesn't require an introduction. But on behalf of organizers of this erudite lecture series, it's my duty to introduce him very briefly once more. Professor Lal was born in Delhi and raised in India, Indonesia, Japan, and the United States. He joined the History of Faculty at UCLA in 1993. He was elected a Fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Science in February 2000. He teaches a broad range of courses in Indian history, comparative colonial history, subaltern theory, and Indian historiography, as well as conduct seminars on the contemporary politics of knowledge, post-colonial theory, and the politics of culture. Moreover, he has written regularly on a wide variety of subjects for over 250 scholarly articles, periodicals, and newspapers in the US, India, and Britain. While on leave from UCLA in 2010-11, he served as a professor of history at the University of Delhi. He is known for his radical political views and for making his history lectures available for free on his YouTube channel. Lal is the author or editor of 18 books. The range of Lal's intellectual, cultural, and political interest is perhaps best explored in his collection of essays too. Lal's views on American society and politics have earned him a place in David Hrold's book, The Professor, the 101 Most Dangerous Academics in America. I am extremely overwhelmed to welcome Professor Vinay Lal on behalf of organizers to this second session of erudite lecture series on the topic Globalizing Protest, a New Architecture of Street Dissent. Also, I welcome authorities of Kerala Higher Education Council for collaborating with us in this erudite program. Next, I would like to welcome Reverend Dr. Martin K.A., the principal of our college, for his wonderful administration and working towards connecting young minds to strive towards success and achievement. Also welcome Dr. Andrew Thomas, HOD of English, for being the strong supporter of this program. I am so proud to welcome Dr. C.S. Biju, Dean of International Affairs and coordinator of this program, for taking great efforts to organize it in a good manner. Let me welcome colleagues of my department, as well as all other departments of our college, to this lecture series. Lastly, but not leastly, welcome all the well-wishers, deans, faculty, research scholars, and students from St. Thomas College, other institutions in Kerala, India, and all over the world. And without your support and encouragement, it would not have come to reality. Once again, welcome you all to this erudite lecture series and have a nice time. Thank you all.
Vinay?
Yeah, should I start?
Sure, okay. Vinay. Please, welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, all of you at St. Thomas College for arranging, my brief tenure, as it were, with the Kerala State Higher Education Council, and thanks for arranging the lectures. Let me say this by way of a preface. The subject of today's talk is something that will, of course, come up in the third lecture as well, which is 3 days from now. And in fact, actually, what I wish to argue today is perhaps in a manner of speaking, best addressed by looking at Shaheen Bagh. But I wanted to set aside an entire lecture for the subject of Shaheen Bagh because, in my judgment, it is, I would say, perhaps in some ways, the most radical advance in thinking about nonviolence since the time of Gandhi and Ghaffar Khan. I would say that in some respects, it's even more significant in its implications than something like the American Civil Rights Movement. And so therefore, I wanted to put aside an entire lecture for that rather than addressing it today. But I would urge those of you who are listening in today to think about the subject of Shaheen Bagh as well, something, as I said, that I'm going to address in my last lecture. Now, the other thing I want to say by way of a preface is this, that I first started writing on this subject before the coronavirus pandemic hit us all over the world. And the coronavirus pandemic has in some ways complicated the tenor of my arguments, because what I'm really speaking about here, and I will of course explain and adumbrate what I mean by a new architecture of street protest as I see it. But the coronavirus pandemic, as many of you are doubtless aware, has in fact actually resulted in a large number of demonstrations in many countries of the world, particularly in the Anglophone world and in Western Europe, in Canada, Australia, the United States, Germany, France, countries like that. There have been lots of demonstrations by people which have really taken to the streets, not just on social media, lots of demonstrations which have taken to the streets, protesting against what they see as the restrictions on freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and all of that, which have been brought about, which have come about as a consequence of the pandemic. Because one of the central questions that the pandemic has raised, which is a subject really of another lecture altogether, or a series of lectures, and that is the tension between civil society and the state. Because one fundamental question that we can pose apropos of the coronavirus pandemic is whether the pandemic has not in fact actually strengthened the state relative to civil society in many countries. And certainly I think in Western Europe, to some degree in Eastern Europe, and in the Anglophone world, as I've said, we have seen a large number of demonstrations. And some of you may remember that just shortly before the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression in Ukraine started and wiped out everything else from the news, as typically happens with these kinds of things, that just before that, there had been this remarkable protest in Ottawa, in the Canadian capital, which was very much a protest on the streets of the city, right? So this is what I mean, that the coronavirus pandemic has complicated the tenor of many of the arguments that I wish to advance here, but that these arguments that I'm making here, that I'm going to put forward, are arguments that I've been thinking about and that I'd written about in shorter pieces well before the coronavirus pandemic started. Now, everyone is looking these days at online protests, social media, and the internet. There are, for example, over a dozen scholarly articles already which look at the role of social media and online protests in the making of the Shaheen Bagh movement. I mean, I'm talking about a dozen really scholarly articles, and there are, of course, dozens of shorter popular pieces. And I am the last person to suggest that we should not be looking at social media, the internet, and so on, because way back in the 1990s, and I say this simply really more as a matter of fact rather than with pride, I was one of the first people to have published a very long article in the journal Diaspora, where I had argued that the nature of the political discussions that take place will change dramatically because it's all going to move online. And one of the things I had suggested that we should do is we should look at how Hindu histories are being made on the internet, right? So this goes back to the 1990s. So I am, of course, the last person to disavow an interest in looking at social media and the internet, but more broadly conceived in every aspect of it, and trying to understand the nature of protest and dissent today. But the thesis of my talk today is that the events of the last 5 years in particular suggest very strongly the return of the street as the principal site for the citizenry of a country to register its political views and its political dissent. I think the street is all prevalent, and this is what I really wish to look into is, well, what is the architecture of this street protest? What is the semiotics? And of course, there's always been street protests before, but we can also ask a number of other ancillary questions. Has the scale of street protests intensified? What is different in the street protests today in comparison to the street protests, let's say in the late 1960s, when you had the Vietnam War and when you had student unrest? In fact, actually, in a large number of countries, I mean, not just the United States, but France and Mexico, among many other countries, right? The revolts broke out at the universities. The fact that I'm mentioning universities, of course, suggests already one difference, that in those days, many of the revolts really were student revolts and were confined to universities. And there is some element of that, even, for example, in one of the things that I'm going to discuss at some length today, namely the Hong Kong movement, because the siege of universities was certainly a part of it, but it was really only a very small part of it relative to the movement at large, right? So I think that the situation is quite different in this respect today. And it is certainly the case that the scale of these protests has really intensified. We can think of what Ranajit Guha, whom I'm going to return to later on, the Indian historian and founder of the Subaltern Studies School, as it was known, in a extraordinary book called Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. He described the various ways in which one can think about how insurgencies, in this case, peasant insurgencies, spread. What are the ways in which they transmit? What are the languages in which they transmit, right? What are the semiotics of insurgency? And so one of the things we're going to be looking at today is what are the semiotics of street protests? And that's where that book, I think, is quite handy. But one of the ideas he had raised was this notion of what he called territoriality. What is the territory that that a protest occupies, and how does this territory really grow? I would also say that one other difference between the street protests, particularly, I would say, since about 2019, going back to the Hong Kong movement and the street protests of the 1960s, is that those protests were almost invariably in the 60s intended to move the state to action. So, for example, the Vietnam protests were intended to make the state reconsider, the American state reconsider its position on the Vietnam War. The supposition was that the state must be energized from the outside, but the hope was that the outcome of these protests would be to induce the state to make the right moves and gestures. The new architecture of street protests, I think, has a different notion of autonomy in part that it works with. Now, what are the reasons for such protests? And why is it really the case that these protests have really intensified? I can only point your attention to something called the Global Protest Tracker, which is a project of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace and International Studies, something like that. You can find it easily on the internet, and it's a website that tracks all the major protest movements, particularly street protests, and you can see the scale of activity is really quite astronomical. The vast majority of countries in the last 5 years have gone through significant street protests, right? And the reasons for these are very often similar. Each situation has its own particularities, of course, but growing inequality in every country is certainly one fundamental cause for these street protests. The anger of the people against what is broadly called corruption. This lecture series is being sponsored by the Kerala State Higher Education Council and the St. Thomas College in Thrissur, and so much of the audience is in India, and of course in India, all of the protests that were launched, let's say, by Anna Hazare against corruption. What he understood by corruption is something that I'm not going to take up here. Obviously, I'm just mentioning, the fact that corruption, as it's commonly understood, has commonly been one reason for such global mobilization of protests. Right? There are obviously some common threads to all of these protests. It is also the case that news of protests in one country moves rapidly to other countries. So, for example, just take a very common illustration. You will see a more detailed discussion of this when I talk about Hong Kong and Myanmar. I'm not really going to talk about India today, because the talk is really structured around some larger theoretical and historiographic arguments of the sort that I've been giving and will continue to give. And then I want to really look at the case of Hong Kong and Myanmar. But an illustration of these protests moving rapidly from one country to another, consider that on 14th October 2019, around 9 or 10 Catalan separatist leaders were convicted over a 2017 referendum that the government had declared illegal, but that had been carried out. And these Catalan separatist leaders were each sentenced up to 12 years in jail. Now, shortly after the sentence was given, people in Barcelona received a message on a popular encrypted messaging service telling them to go to the Barcelona airport, mimicking a tactic used by Hong Kong protesters. The young people making their way to the airport shouted, quote, "We are going to do a Hong Kong. We are going to do a Hong Kong." Right? Now people must be in the streets. All revolts start there. Look at Hong Kong, end quote. This is what one protester told the Reuters news agency. Right? So you can see how the news spreads. And here again, this idea that we're going to do a Hong Kong, the Hong Kong had really become something of a model, something of a template, and particularly the fact that the Hong Kong protests really developed a kind of an architecture and semiotics of protest. Right? I should also say, and this is something that will, of course, be a subject that will be addressed at much greater length in my concluding lecture on Shaheen Bagh. One consequence of reclaiming the streets is that it gives a greater sense of power to women, especially in countries where women will typically only be found on the streets accompanied by men, which sometimes happens, for example, in South Asian countries, certainly in India and Pakistan, that there are certain public spheres that are really public spheres that women wouldn't go into unless they were accompanied by men. And that is certainly true of some streets in major metropolises and even in smaller towns. Now, before I move to the examples of Hong Kong and Myanmar, I want to say a few things about how do we understand insurgencies, right? These insurgencies, and how do we understand a very large subject here, but I just want to begin with this because there is a kind of what we might call a provocation from Mao that comes to mind, where a very famous passage of his, this is from something he wrote in 1927. I'm sure that some of you are aware that Mao actually traveled around the countryside widely in the early days of the Communist Party. The Communist Party had been founded, the Chinese Communist Party had been founded in Shanghai, and he actually went to a number of rural areas and wrote very lengthy, almost scientific reports on the condition of the peasantry. Some of these have only recently been translated into English, but there is one document, which is a very famous document in the Mao's canon. It's called the Report on the Conditions of the Peasantry in Hunan Province, 1927, which was translated very early on. And this is what he says, and I quote here: "The peasants are clear-sighted. Who is bad and who is not? Who is the worst and who is not quite so vicious? Who deserves special punishment and who deserves to be let off lightly? The peasants keep clear accounts, and very seldom has a punishment exceeded the crime." This is, if we paraphrase this, this is really one of those testaments to ideological purity, which is not only the bane of clear thinking, it is a fundamental problem, because as we know, revolutions, to invoke the old cliche, revolutions have a way of devouring their own children, right? And Mao, this passage, the peasants are clear-sighted. See, this is really a kind of an invocation to violence, which will increase as he goes on. Right? Secondly, and this is the most famous part of this quotation, secondly, a revolution is not a dinner party or writing an essay or painting a picture or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. A rural revolution is a revolution by which the peasantry overthrows the power of the feudal landlord class. Without using the greatest force, the peasants cannot possibly overthrow the deep-rooted authority of the landlords, which has lasted for thousands of years. End quote. And I want to suggest to you that what we are going to see, at least through my reading of what's happening here, is something very different, right? Yes, and these street protests are not a dinner, party. They're not a piece of embroidery. They're not a Sunday picnic by any stretch of the imagination. But these protests are part of the history of the reinvention of nonviolence, right? And so even though the title of the series is just Studies in Dissent and Protest, it seems to me that the only worthwhile protest really is nonviolent protest, right? There's one further book I want to very briefly mention. I will get to Ranajit Gua later in the course of my talk when we get to Hong Kong. And that is a book by Alain Badot. It's called The Rebirth of History, Times of Riots and Uprisings, published by Verso in 2010. So, more than a decade before this present moment, and almost a decade before the 2019 movement in Hong Kong, and even several years before the 2013-2014 protests in Hong Kong, which is the first series of protests, although my narrative would largely begin in 2019. But he's interested fundamentally in some of the questions that I'm interested in. He tackles them in a very different way, partly because he doesn't really have any commitment to the idea of nonviolence as such, I would argue, and also because, like most Western European thinkers, he is haunted by the figure of Marx and haunted by the narrative of capitalism, that everything eventually comes down to that, right? So the question is, are we seeing the beginnings or first studies of a global protest movement or uprising against the modern world system, right? So when he is writing in 2014, of course, what he had seen, and this, when he's writing in 2010, this is really at the moment of the Arab Spring. That is what, right? It is the image of that fruit vendor, right? I think it was in Tunisia, if I remember correctly. Who becomes the iconic figure of the beginning of the movement, and then, as we know, it spread to other countries in North Africa and portions of Egypt, right? So there was this, to use George Antonius's phrase from a very different period from the 1920s, there was this Arab revolt, there was the Arab Spring now. And this is what really set Badeau to think. And before that, of course, you had, the revolutions in Eastern Europe, in the countries that had been part of the Iron Curtain. Right? So this is the backdrop. And he's thinking to himself, are we seeing the stirrings of a global protest movement or uprising against the modern world system? A system that is characterized, and he's writing in 2010, it's much worse now because he's deploring the growing power of the oligarchy, right? And also what he says, the predictable views of liberals who still feel that electoral democracies will deliver certain kinds of dividends and results, desirable results. He says that we are now living in a time of riots. And for him, this is the possibility, this is the moment of possibility, because it's a moment of the rebirth of what he calls movement communism, right? But I invoke him because I'm suggesting that there are different frameworks for trying to understand the scenario that I'm referring to today, namely a certain intensification of street protests. The fact that street protests now have really occurred and continue to occur in many countries of the world, regardless of the political system, actually, right? Regardless of the political system. I mean, they may occur in a democracy such as, to whatever degree it's a democracy, the United States, India to a less democracy to even a lesser degree, and obviously even in countries such as Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, Ecuador, Venezuela, and so on, right? So countries with substantially different political systems to some degree or the other. And what he does actually there is really then is he sets out a typology of different kinds of riots. I have some reservation also about the word riots, because let us not forget that the word riot is immediately used by the state to, in fact, completely delegitimize a protest, right? And when there is a riot, it means that there is, of course, a breakdown of law and order, and every state arrogates to itself the unquestioned right to actually impose law and order, right? So this is something I think that we should bear in mind also is, what is the language that we use to discuss something like this. But of course, Badeau is a very sophisticated thinker, and for him, the riot is actually the potentiality of the emergence of truth, right? This is what he's going to do. He's going to first discuss the immediate right and the latent right and what he calls a historical right. And one way to think of this scale is you move from something that is highly localized to something that is now going to be territorialized increasingly, right? And you will see a process of intensification, so that the degree of localization gradually really diminishes, right? So this is how he goes about really creating a certain kind of framework for the discussion of rights. Now, let me move on to the question of Hong Kong. And what I want to do is very briefly. So unlike the previous talk, which was where I shared a PowerPoint throughout the course of my talk, here I want to just share a couple of small videos and then some pictures later on, some images, because when I'm discussing the semiotics, it will be important to see what are the ways in which street protesters have worked in countries such as Hong Kong and Myanmar. But let me first share with you a couple of very, very short videos. So let me see if this works here. All right, I think this is it. All right. So the first, Biju, are you able to see the screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
excellent. Okay, so this is a short 2-3 minute video, and let's just watch it and keep in mind everything, obviously, that I've said about the emergence of the street, and, and what I'm going to describe later on as the semiotics of these street protests. Let's hope the video works here. When it's embedded here, it should. I had tested it out. Okay, we'll have to go back to. All right. So I think that all of you would have surmised that this is a video which is a collage of images, shot in Myanmar or Burma, as it used to be known before. I will return to some elements of this later on, but just want to call to your attention a number of things very quickly. For example, a lot of the signs that are being held by the people are signs in English. So they're all aware, as is the case of these protest movements in many parts of the world, that there is a constituency out there, an international constituency. All right. Notice the use of tear gas, which is very common. Of course, all the images here are images which emerge from the context of the street. We want democracy, painted on the, so, before there was, George Floyd and, the use of, painting the streets and all of that. I mean, this was happening incidentally in Hong Kong, even before it happened in Myanmar, and it happened earlier in Myanmar as well. Trampling on the image of the martial, law leader, the military commander of Burma, and so on. Some of these elements, are very striking. Now I'll move to one other short video, also from Burma, and then we'll just look at a couple of still images and then get to Hong Kong.
Tutti nangole kaza, toda pinuan di recita, di kujan dosa piti karo lejo di kurepa, lo kwe kong yila kwe ha, si jan jan o si mo ma ma, kete yao che shen ka me ta mai kuja tui se, di tai kwe ku se. 跳下北野菜不拉，肉鸡娘肉瓜的，公公的来了没几的呀，流浪着我给我在为我想为你家，路飞了我的刚才，走到天荒地老的，你没不到我想为你我刚刚你都别路对吧，老对空你的来哈。 一家家户一帮帮忙，一定要齐心抗美爱不干对对。一代鬼不住路推来推个脚家的也塞吧，肉切呀肉麻贝，古红的两杯一的呀，我留来的画面和在鬼不想回的家，路有别的我的家。
All right, and just a couple of still images, not videos, from Hong Kong, and then I'll get out of the PowerPoint and come back to it later on. So these are just two images from Hong Kong. You can see a sea of umbrellas. I'll speak about that in just a few moments. And here's another image. Both of these are from 2019, and so the first one is from August 2019, and the second one is the demonstration on New Year's Day in 2020, just before the coronavirus pandemic, shortly before the coronavirus onset of the pandemic. All right, so let me just stop share here for a moment. All right, now, so before I go on to a discussion of Hong Kong and Myanmar, which is the second half of my talk, I just want to spend a few minutes trying to think through the whole another way of thinking through the whole philosophy of resistance. And here there's a book that was published quite recently, which I think is a very fine provocation to start thinking about the notion of disobedience. This is a book by Frederick Gross, G-R-O-S. The book is called Disobey, the Philosophy of Resistance. And the first thing I want to call to your mind is that, of course, I mean, that what is happening in all of these protests is that what people are doing is they are fundamentally disobeying, right? And we need to understand what is the philosophy of disobedience here in particular, because I think, as Gross suggests, and I think as becomes very clear from a study, let's say, of something like the Nuremberg trial at the end of World War II, the Nuremberg trials. And that is that, if you think about the Nuremberg trials, it is the first time in history, really the first time in history, that a fundamental postulate of modern civilization was overturned, right? And some implications for how we think about these protests today. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that, go back to someone like Immanuel Kant, writing on education in the late 18th century. So some of his thoughts on education have been collected there. And one of the things that Kant understood very well. I mean, we use a different language. We talk about how school, helps to socialize children, right? Of course, what it helps them to become is docile and completely obedient. And you are rewarded for being obedient and punished for disobeying, right? So parents and school, in that sense, almost invariably will punish you for disobeying and reward you, or at least they'll be maybe just neutral, but you may not be rewarded for obeying, but you certainly will not be punished for obeying, right? And one of the things that Kant says is that by discipline, men are placed in subjection to the laws of mankind and brought to feel their constraint. This, however, must be accomplished early. Children, for example, are first sent to school, not so much with the object of their learning something, right? So much for this liberal shibboleth about, schooling is all about education and learning. No, Kant is very clear what it's really about, but rather that they may become used to sitting still and doing exactly as they are told, unquote. Right? In other words, in this scenario, obedience is what is thought of as what humanizes us, right? And disobedience becomes monstrous. Now, at the Nuremberg trials, the principle that was established in consequence of the defense that virtually everyone at the Nuremberg trials, when the German war criminals were brought there, from the highest, of course, it was only the highest ranking officials of the regime and other associated, wealthy businessmen who had funded the regime, etc. But people who were really extremely wealthy or powerful, they were the ones who were tried. I mean, there were lower layers of trials as well, but obviously foot soldiers were not tried because you'd have to try, hundreds of thousands of them, right? But whatever the rank of the person who was tried, all of them, when asked why they had done what they had, in one line, their response was, we were just following orders. We were obeying orders. And the Nuremberg trial, therefore, becomes the first instance in history where people are punished, so to speak, for following orders, right? It is obedience which has become the monstrosity. Now, obedience which has become the monstrosity. And this is important because fundamentally, the ethics of resistance involves a certain kind of disobedience. Right? This is critically a part of it. And that is why I invoke Gross at this juncture before moving to my two particular case studies. All right. So let me move to the case of Hong Kong. While simply suggesting that this intensification of protests that I've talked about, I've got extensive notes on countries such as Ecuador and Chile and Lebanon, where I looked at some of the literature of how these protests developed, and so I can speak to some of those later on. But I want to turn to Hong Kong because I want to suggest that for our times, Hong Kong gifts us a new architecture of street protest, right? And the first of its kind in the quote post-truth era, and critically alerts us to the fact that the question of dissent will be the paramount question of our times. Now, there was, as all of you know, what was called the Occupy movements, which followed the global financial crisis of 2008. Hong Kong had a series of protests known as Occupy Central in 2013, and then the Umbrella Movement in 2014. The Occupy logic What is that logic? You occupy, for example, the city's main thoroughfares or main square, depending on which city you're in, right? Or the business district. In Hong Kong, this occupy logic, occupying the city's main thoroughfares for almost 80 days, was predicated on the fact that it would force the government to the negotiating table. That didn't happen. The movement was originally called, by the way, Occupy Central with Love and Peace. OCLP was an acronym. Their leaders, there were three leaders, Benny Tai, Chan Kin Kan. They were both actually put into jail. And what were they demanding? They were demanding what the protesters would demand years later as well: changes to Hong Kong's electoral system, more transparency in the democratic process, and of course, an insistence that the autonomy of Hong Kong be retained. Because recall, of course, that Hong Kong had passed over to China from Britain 23 years ago. 23 years ago as of now. So 15, 16 years ago, whenever 2013, 14, had passed over to China, and China had this whole policy whereby they was going to have essentially one nation and two systems, right? That they were going to allow the autonomy to places like Hong Kong and so on, right? So this Occupy movement of 2013 is going to merge into what is known as the umbrella movement of 2014, whose leader was Joshua Wong, and he was going to be arrested shortly thereafter, and he's going to be released and rearrested. And practically speaking, to cut a long story short, he's been in jail pretty much for the last 6-7 years. Certainly as of last month, he was still in jail, right? The protests that I'm interested in are the protests of 2019, right? So this is the next phase, which began on March 15th. They are precipitated by the announcement by PRC, the People's Republic of China, that there's going to be a fugitive offenders amendment bill on extradition. Okay, initially it begins with that, and then the demands are going to multiply and become diffused in some unexpected ways. The extradition problem had to do really with Taiwan and Hong Kong, with mainland China only in the mix. All right. I don't want to really get into all the details because they're really not necessary for the purposes of my argument, right? The fear was that this one country, two systems principle was going to be now violated, because fundamentally this extradition bill meant that some people would be extradited to the mainland, where, of course, the possibility of anything but a short trial, was almost zero. That they would, ostensibly be given a trial, but they would be convicted and then put away for, a large number of years, sometimes for what were really minor infractions, if any, of the law, right? So these demonstrators were initially demonstrated against the extradition bill, but then they're going to ask for more fundamental reforms in how elections are conducted and the democratic process and transparency, as I said, in the democratic process as a whole. They also are going to ask for amnesty for all political prisoners. They insisted that the large-scale protests, and now I'm talking about some months later, because as you will recall that the Hong Kong movement, which began approximately March 15th, continues until sometime after the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. And it is the coronavirus pandemic which gives the state the pretext, as it did in India, because the Shaheen Bagh movement, which I'll speak about later on in the next lecture, the government found that they were not able to put this movement down. And it was only on March 24th, 2020, when the Prime Minister of India declared a national lockdown with 4 hours notice, right, to the country. It was literally when this lockdown went into effect 2 hours after that, that the Shaheen Bagh movement was just completely eviscerated. Right? I mean, in the middle of the night, the Delhi police came and they took down all the posters and banners and wiped clean all the murals, which I'll show you in my next lecture, because I photographed all of them in December 2019, right? So this is important, that this starts in March in Hong Kong, March 2019. Now we're talking about June 2019, and the movement will continue until the pandemic provides the pretext to mainland China to move in, right? But the detail I wanted to share here is that the large-scale protest on June 12, 2019, when the bill, which had not yet been passed, the extradition bill, was scheduled for a second reading in the legislature. So the protest was planned for that day. One of the demands of the protesters was that this protest should not be characterized in official writing and in the media, in the official media, as a riot, right? This is very interesting, but not surprising, right? To some officials, it might have appeared as an opaque demand, but it would be no surprise, this demand, to a student of colonialism who is well aware of the fact that the colonial state constantly endeavored to reduce political protests to ordinary crimes. And a riot is usually in the category of an ordinary crime, right? So that's the context for it. Now, how should we characterize the nature of the protests over a course of 1 year? These young protesters eschewed the fixed, immobile occupation strategies of the past in favor of a highly mobile, agile style of protest. Right? The previous Hong Kong movements, 2013-14, had leaders. This movement has no leader at all. Right? A rally might turn into a march. A march may begin in one direction and abruptly change direction abruptly. Right? The focus of a particular protest might actually emerge in the course of the march itself. In some protests, subgroups of protesters dispatch themselves to carry out targeted wildcat occupations of government buildings, flooding the entrance lobbies, escalators, and lifts. When the government declared the building closed, to take one instance, and dismissed staff for the day, the protesters dispersed and moved on to their next target. These protesters said that they took their inspiration from Bruce Lee. And I'll show you a slide in just a moment. I'm talking about the famous Bruce Lee or martial law films, martial arts films, sorry. Water can flow, he said, or it can crash. It is, of course, also the nature of water to be free, that water will seep through every place, right? It is the intrinsic metaphor in many ways for freedom. I also want to suggest one thing here, which I will only suggest. I'm kind of elaborating on it, and yet a full-fledged philosophical exploration of this idea will be a different talk. And that is that what you see here in this new agile style of protest, right, is the opposition of the moved and the unmoved. Much of the world actually is now caught between the moved and the unmoved. There are those, you think of all the refugees in so many parts of the world, right? Okay, that's one element of this larger picture of what I'm calling the dialectic of the moved and the unmoved. Now, in these protests, Telegram chat groups are used. So here, social media comes in, the internet, and all of this will come in. But remember that the location, the site is still the street, right? These protests are not protests that you can simply reduce to social media. Some people would like to believe that social media is really where all protest takes place, right? I'm trying to suggest something really to the contrary. I'm saying that social media is certainly enabling it in many ways, because there are obviously ways that you have to mobilize. I mean, if you look at Ranajit Guha's book, which I will come back to yet again, Elementary Aspect of Peasant Insurgency, well, how did peasants in 19th century India mobilize? And one of the things that he talks about is chapatis, right? The British couldn't understand it. They were sending chapatis to each other. These chapatis were actually coded messages. When a villager received a chapati in a village, it was an indication for him, it's necessary for you to revolt, right? And he would then send the chapatis to other villagers in other villages. Right? So that was, so to speak, the social media of those times. But what you're seeing here is a kind of participatory democracy. And the most astonishing thing, as the ethnographic research on some of these has now shown, is that, these protesters, you're talking about, of course, a very affluent country, they're all carrying cell phones. Even in a non-affluent country such as India, cell phone usage is extremely wide today, as we all know. They may not have all the apps on their phones, perhaps, right? But it's very wide, cell phone coverage. Now, these people would actually take a poll on the cell phone. Do we stay or do we move to a next target, or do some of us move? So they're enacting that democracy in the very protest there itself, you see, right? And this is the kind of participatory democracy they would actually like to see. Participatory democracy really on the move, so to speak. And of course, someone might say, well, isn't it the case that the state had the power to cut off, for example, internet connections? I mean, that's what China does. That's what India does very often, right? And the answer is yes. But that's why the protesters started using AirDrop, which you find on iPhones, because you can send images to each other over the Bluetooth connection without the need for a mobile connection. And this was widely used, really widely used, right? Now, to ensure that new supplies could reach the front lines quickly, Hong Kong protesters developed a unique system of hand signals, right? To send messages through the crowd about what equipment is required, right? Though there was considerably increased use of tear gas, even in densely residential neighborhoods, it had comparatively little effect. Why? Because the protesters found that the protesters had found unusual ways to neutralize this gas. When a tear gas shell lands among the crowd, what do these people do? They cover the shell with the traffic cone that creates a chimney and funnels the smoke away. Water is then poured to douse the shell, right? There is, of course, a complex semiotics that is going to develop around it as well. Let me now share some more images and one short video, and then we will be dispensed with the PowerPoint for good, and I can get back to the rest of my lecture. So the semiotics of peasant insurgencies, according to Ranajit Guha, he talks about 6 fundamental ideas, what he calls negation, or what Mao, in the same document that I had referred to before, right? The report on the conditions of the peasantry in Hunan province. It's terrible. It's fine. Some of you might remember that passage. That is the word turned upside down, right? So what was terrible from the point of view of the landowners was fine from the point of view of the landless peasants. Then he describes ambiguity, right? And I'm suggesting here, incidentally, why am I using this here? Because I'm suggesting that this is a very good way to think through some of the semiotics of the new architecture of street protest that I'm suggesting has emerged if one looks at street protests in a number of different countries, right? So ambiguity is where crime and insurgency are 2 different courts. That the state would like to collapse it into one, but they are in fact 2 very different things. Modality, specific targets. You don't just target things randomly. You target the district collector's office in 1857, 58, or before that, because this is where the records are kept, the tax records are kept, etc. Solidarity, the linking of disparate groups. People come into these movements for different reasons very often, but solidarity means to find ways to link these disparate groups. Transmission, what is the mode of spreading? I give the illustration of chapatis. Rumors is another way in which, right, transmission takes place, and territoriality. How far does insurgency really spread? Now, this is a kind of sign that was carried widely by protesters in Hong Kong. Be water, be water, be like water. We are formless, we are shapeless, we can flow, we can crash, we are like water, we are Hong Kongers. And then you get this is actually a statue of Bruce Lee, and there are these protesters who have stood hands to form a human ring around this statue. What you see is a police officer firing tear gas canisters. This is a photograph, 31st August 2019. And one of the things that is quite characteristic of all of these movements, of course, is that they're largely led by the young. Largely led by the young, sometimes by university students. But here what you see is a large number of the elderly. Just look at the number of people with white hair, right? See where the cursor is. You can see that elderly marching on 17 July 2019 to support young people's anti-extradition bill protests. This is another form, of course, of solidarity, right? Now what you're going to see in the next 10 images is you're going to see images of umbrella. Let me pause here for a second. Let's go back to Ranajit Gua. Right? Or let's just go back to the experience of those of you who are situated in India. Now you know that, and there are many films that show that in a village, traditionally only certain elites could carry the umbrella, right? The Chhatri. Of course, the umbrella is also the sign of sovereignty. Let's not forget that, right? The sign of sovereignty, right? But only the elites or the headman could do that. And Ranjit Gua has a long, discussion of umbrellas in the use of the village, how people use the village to subvert authority. And more recently, another historian of India by the name of Sachi Bhattacharya, who passed away a few years ago, he wrote a book called The Colonial State, Theory and Practice, where he discusses also sort of the semiotics of the umbrella, that if an Indian opened an umbrella in the presence of an Englishman, it was considered to be an offense, right? So one of the ways in which we can think about it, a subject for someone to write a whole book on, is the use of everyday objects to create a semiotics of dissent, right? And what you see in Hong Kong is really quite extraordinary use of umbrellas. And I'm going to just quickly go through a series of images and explain what is really happening with these umbrellas, because this is all part of that new architecture of street protest. So here are demonstrators marching along Nathan Road during a protest on 7 July 2019. And the umbrellas here say, read together, no extradition to China, withdraw the evil bill. All right. And then in the following image, what you see here, well, before that, so what I've laid down here is simply, 6-7 different uses of the umbrella that you find in these in the umbrella movement of 2014, carried on into 2019, 1920. It's a symbol of resistance. It was used as a way to camouflage, to protect the identity of the resistor from CCTV cameras. Hong Kong is one of the places in the world, along with many cities in mainland China and London, for example, with extraordinary number of CCTV cameras, right? I mean, they're basically CCTV cameras all over the city. It's a way to neutralize the umbrella, as we're going to find out, CCTV cameras, to shield oneself from the police, to take cover, to block or jam doors, even to use it as something of a weapon, right? So here you find a demonstrator raising his umbrella during a standoff with police on July 27th. These are all photographs, of course, from Hong Kong. This is Lady Liberty. So this is, their own rendition, of course, of the famous Statue of Liberty. an emblem of the pro-democracy movement. This photograph again from 2019, right? You see the umbrella, instead of wielding the torch, here's an umbrella. And here you see the umbrellas, hanging umbrellas to block CCTV cameras outside a police station. You can see right there, it says Traffic Branch Headquarters, Hong Kong Police Force. These umbrellas are being wielded as makeshift shields against a cloud of tear gas. All right. Here you see police spraying demonstrators with pepper hose during a protest near the Legislative Council. And you can see how the umbrellas are being used actually to ward off the force of that hose, the water coming from that. Protesters taking cover during a clash with police under umbrellas. And here these umbrellas are being used to block doors inside the Legislative Council building, which they had occupied. And in this one, you see a demonstrator batting away a tear gas canister. So if you see where my cursor is moving around here, so that was a tear gas canister that had been thrown, and he's just using it almost like a cricket bat to sort of like flick it away, away from the demonstrators. And here, protesters are throwing umbrellas towards the police during a standoff in New Town Plaza shopping mall, right? So now, who would have thought, right? Who would have thought that the umbrella could, in fact, have, if I may put it this way, not simply dual use, as they sometimes say of certain objects, but could in fact be deployed, right, in such an extraordinary way to create a very different kind of protest, right? Now, these were some of the sign languages that I were talking about, because they use them, and we'll see a little video where you're going to see how messages were conveyed that if somebody needs a mask, someone needs a helmet, someone needs an umbrella, they would use these sign language, and the message is going to be conveyed down the line, as it were. It was found to be extraordinarily, really effective, right? No need here for sophisticated technologies, anything of that kind. I think the Luddites would love it, a movement of this kind. Now here's a video that I want to share with you. That's the traffic cone. You put it on a tear gas canister. That's the smoke goes through the chimney, and very often what they do is they put the seat down another instance, douse it with some water. All right. So, okay, and then finally, here's one very short video, which gives you a clearer sense of how these hand signals were used. All right, so I'll stop the share, stop share here, and now move on. I mean, I have a whole discussion, and I can entertain questions about the section that I'm going to skip here because I want to get to the last case study, as it were, and that is Myanmar. And the section that I'm skipping here is the whole question of what is it that precluded China from actually putting this down with brute force right at the outset, because I think you'll all agree with me that China is not a country that is reluctant about using brute force. If it has to, it certainly used it at Tiananmen Square, and we know what treatment has been meted out to the Uyghurs, the Muslims, in China. Of course, there are reports. I mean, I'm not here really to discuss the veracity of these reports, and another subject unto itself about the Muslims essentially having been placed in China in concentration camps or something like that. The Chinese, of course, do not even remotely agree with that assessment. But the point simply is that we are aware of the fact that repression of dissent is exceedingly common in China. So what is it that really prevented China from undertaking similarly brute repression right from the outset, rather than in June 2020, which is 16 months after the movement started in 2019? And in June 2020 is when they passed the new security law, right, which essentially then completely demolished the movement, pretty much eviscerated the movement. And of course, it was done largely under the pretext of the pandemic as well, because everything was under lockdown. You couldn't be out in the streets, and obviously, as in many other countries, the violation of lockdown regulations was itself an offense. So there, certainly, the Chinese government had the pretext to put away the Hong Kong protesters, which they certainly did. And the June 2020 new security law, as I said, was a fundamental step in that direction. So that's what I'm omitting here. But I really want to look at what we might describe as the export of the Hong Kong model. And in this case, we can look at Myanmar, a country that people do not ordinarily look at, because usually when studies are done of such protest movements, they usually really look at places like Hong Kong, perhaps something like the farmers' movement in India, which made it to the news all over the world. Now, elections were held in Myanmar in November 2020. I'm not looking, of course, at the earlier history. The National League for Democracy under Aung San Suu Kyi won handily, but the military leaders really refused to accept this verdict, and a coup was engineered on 1st February 2021, which removed the elected government, placed Aung San Suu Kyi under arrest, and that she's very recently she's been in the news again because they've convicted her on a number of other charges as well. The junta declared 1 year of emergency rule after the coup. Some of you may be familiar that under the constitution of Myanmar, 25% of the seats are actually guaranteed to the Tatmadaw. That's basically the military faction, the military, right? Now, since the coup started, very soon after that, a civil disobedience movement arose, attracting support from a broad range of professions, led by medical and healthcare workers, bankers, lawyers, teachers, and engineers across the nation. Demanded that the military return the elected government to power. And shortly after the commencement of the civil disobedience movement, which is how it's known, by the way, in Burma, among those who speak and write and converse in English, that shortly after the commencement of this movement, many professionals and then increasingly Burmese in more ordinary jobs refused to return to work. As is true of the Hong Kong movement, as is true of Shaheen Bagh, what is true of the movement in Burma is it has no singular leader. It really has no leaders, right? This is partly decentralization is one way to speak about it. The correct and proper use of the word anarchy, that is, as a devolution, complete devolution of power, is the other way to think about it. But it harkens back also to this aphorism, as it were, from Bruce Lee: be like the water. Water disperses in many different directions, right? I think that these movements have really followed that course, so to speak. Now, one doctor in Rangoon was interviewed around April 2020 and said this: the CDM movement, civil disobedience movement, is a collective leadership. We are all the followers and leaders. The military coup surprisingly arises and our leaders were detained. We use Facebook for access to social media, and we use other social media to start the civil disobedience movement. The movement has continued to use, and this is again what is common among all these three movements, Shaheen Bagh, which I'm not looking at today, and the Hong Kong movement, and this one is that they are all firmly tethered in the idea of nonviolent resistance. For them, of course, we could take a very strict sort of view of the degree to which the Hong Kong movement was really nonviolent, certainly, let's say, by the standards of Ghaffar Khan or Gandhi. But speaking about the general tenor of the movement, right, rather than taking a very, what we might describe as formalistic view of what constitutes a nonviolent movement. And so, because, for example, not going into work, well, this was part of the non-cooperation movement in India, and this is certainly what was true of the CDM movement in Myanmar that I'm really speaking about. Civilians, he says, will not use any products that are military related, and they will not pay any taxes to the government. Right? Civilians will continue to protest in a clever way, a large group or sometimes in front of the embassies, and will continue protest nationwide. Instead of using government hospitals, mobile medical clinics, charity clinics, and private hospitals are being used, as researchers have found out, to provide medical services. Protesters bang pots and pans at night to show disapproval of the coup, as well as to warn neighbors that authorities are nearby and are looking for them, right? And you saw that clip from that video where you see people banging their pots and pans. Of course, I was also reminded, although that's far removed from what is happening here, of the Indian Prime Minister's invocation to the people of the country to use pots and pans. That was the most apolitical. Well, it was very political in a different way, that it was a way of sort of negating dissent. And here, of course, it's being used really to call forth the imagery of dissent, to warn dissenters and so on, right? So the people who have been interviewed, who have been part of the CDM, have said candidly that their tactics have been inspired by the Hong Kong protests, right? And in particular, the Be Water movement, of which I'd given you something of an idea when I discussed it very briefly and showed you the image from Bruce Lee. There is also something called the Milk Tea Alliance. This is an alliance for three, 4 countries in Southeast Asia where milk tea is quite common. Sometimes portions of India have been included in that alliance. But this is it's a campaign of the Milk Tea Alliance is a campaign of internet users from Thailand, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and then Myanmar. And they actually prepared a large online manual for protests, which was then translated into Burmese. And I'll show you a little clip from that very, very shortly, along with the last set of 3 or 4 images. What is interesting is, in looking at the Myanmar movement, is that the CDM has exercised a lot of creativity. It's shown a lot of creativity. So apart from banging pots and pans, not having leaders, being able to disperse, and all of that, that is a kind of a mobile revolutionary core, if you want to think of it that way. What are the other forms of creativity? There's one that I'm going to look at in some detail, with which I'll pretty much close. But let me give you a general overview. So the literature that has emerged, the small literature that has been emerged on this suggests that, for example, cars are disabled deliberately in the middle of the street, on bridges and thoroughfares, blocking traffic from every direction. When prodded by passers-by, as one reporter wrote, owners of the vehicles shrug and feign engine trouble or an empty gas tank. Defiant citizens lay down on train tracks to start rail traffic. They have emptied accounts from military-owned banks, and they have plastered pictures of the junta leader, General Aung Lang, on sidewalks for pedestrians to trample. You saw a very, very small glimmer of that in one of the videos, just momentarily. If you were really focused on that video, you would have seen it over there. So, these are some of the ways in which they have created a new kind of semiotics of protest on the streets. Artists have been very active. There are actually a substantial number of websites now which document the kind of work that artists have done. Music has been important, and at least historians of Southeast Asia are aware of the fact that Burma actually has a very rich tradition, or Myanmar as it's now known, has a very rich tradition of using painting and music for this kind of purposes. But this is all in the service of really a non-violent movement. And remember, of course, that China has, as it does in Hong Kong, a huge footprint in Burma too. The military there has increasingly used facial recognition technology purchased, of course, from China, and artificial intelligence, right? So the scenarios in that sense are very similar to what you find in Hong Kong, although, of course, the socioeconomic data indicate two very different societies, because Hong Kong is relatively far more affluent than Myanmar. It's also far more integrated into the world economy. Hong Kong has, in fact, been critically important to the world economy in many ways, whereas Myanmar went through a long period of isolation. And then even when it was not under isolation, for various reasons, it has obviously been under the cloud of sanctions and so on. All right. Now, what is that particular semiotics I want to show you? One strategy that the protesters adopted was to use women's clothing. Let me explain, right? Women's clothing to block the military, all right? Okay, so it involved hanging women's sarongs or their undergarments on clotheslines above streets across Rangoon and some of the other major cities in Myanmar, right? The reason is that these protesters were quite certain that soldiers would avoid going underneath the clotheslines, because if they did so, that would diminish their hapon, H-P-O-N. This word means men's birthright, which all men are born with on their right shoulder. It is their glory. It invokes the holiness of a man. Let me translate it into a different, more colloquial kind of English, that this idea is very pervasive, that proximity to women's clothing in certain contexts emasculates a man. That if you pass underneath the sarong, for example, of a woman, what it really does is it emasculates you. It certainly diminishes your purity. All right. And Burmese women have long been aware of that. I mean, I recall very distinctly, and then when I was doing work, on this more recently, my mind went back to something that I recall from something that happened in 2007, where Burmese women campaigning for human rights had struck upon a campaign that was called Panties for Peace, where they actually mailed their undergarments, their underwear, to senior Burmese officials in the government in Burma and to all the embassies. because they were working on this superstitious fear that contact with a woman's undergarments robs men of their power, right? Of course, there's been some discussion on whether women should actually use this, because whether, you use these garments as a way of creating a different semiotics of protest, because that might be buying into stereotypes in a different way, right? But nonetheless, it has been done. And in the last set of images I want to share with you, I want to very quickly show you some of these images that we have. So this, by the way, is that manual produced by the Milk Tea Alliance, which is a manual which, so this runs to 75 pages. And you can see, dear brothers and sisters in Myanmar, we are part of the resistance in Hong Kong. And then it says that we're going to tell you exactly what we did. And it describes in painstaking detail, and then it was translated into Burmese, what are the strategies to be used. But let me move on to the set of images I want to show you. So these are the sarongs of these women. And here you see, protesters lined up. And the images that you will see, which will follow, they're just another 2 or 3, also reference the same set of circumstances that I'm describing. But what the argument that I'm giving here is that this was, of course, a very creative use, right, of what we might describe as an everyday object, right, much in the way of an umbrella, right? So you can look at how these things matter in ways that one might not ordinarily expect. And here you see, undergarments here, women hanging these. And in this, you can see, you have a better idea, because it's almost like layers and layers, right? It's like a barricade almost. It's a barricade, which is here, in this case, made of longi, which is women's clothing. And then I think that I have one last image here, which shows a large number of women from Myanmar. Because as I've pointed out, what is characteristic of these movements is the large involvement of women in them as well, all right? Now, on a final note, the coronavirus pandemic, I had started with a brief mention of that, has introduced complications. So I want to just mention one complication, which is that we know that people have taken to the streets for reasons which are antithetical to what one might describe as the advancement of democracy, right? Of course, those who are taking to the streets, and here I'm talking about protests that have taken place in countries like the United States, Germany, Canada. And you will recall that I'd mentioned to you that before Russia invaded Ukraine, just before that, the major news item really in the West at that point was what had been happening in Canada. What had been happening at the border, where, in the city of Ottawa, 400 truckers, with their trucks, had essentially occupied, right, central Ottawa, downtown Ottawa. And they occupied it because these people were saying that, well, we are fed up of all of these vaccine mandates and these restrictions. The Canadian government had passed a new mandate regulation, which was that Canadian truckers who went to the United States and then came back to Canada would have to show proof of vaccination. So if you were just driving a truck within Canada, you don't have to show proof of vaccination. But if you've crossed borders and then you come back, as is the case with people who are flying, if you're flying back, if you're the crew of a ship, the crew of a train, an aeroplane, well, you have to show that. And so that's what the Canadian government had insisted on. And these truckers basically took over, Ottawa for an entire month, right? And of course, they are also protesting in the name of freedom, right? Much like the people in Myanmar, or Hong Kong, or India. But these protests are very different. They're very different. You might say they're only different from the standpoint of someone who thinks that, well, it's only when you have a protest which is animated by people's power. But this is also people's power. right? I'm saying that we will need to reckon with the fact that the street is not only the monopoly, this new architecture of street protest is not only the monopoly of those groups that we empathize with because we see them as groups of people who are largely disenfranchised, right? Or people who are minorities or women. These truckers represent, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, or the protesters, for example, in many parts of the United States or in Germany, they represent often forces of the neo-Nazis. They belong to the far right very often. Some of them are just simply libertarians who do not believe in state intervention, right? Who are deeply suspicious of state intervention. So I don't want to stereotype them into simply neo-Nazis. I mean, there are some people who they really, as I said, are deeply suspicious of state intervention and have long-standing traditions of such kind of suspicion. Right? But we would have to think now also about how the very picture that I have given you is getting a little bit more complicated as a consequence of the fact that in many countries, the people who are involved in street demonstrations, and the truckers, they're not working through social media. Yes, I mean, they're fundraising. They raised an enormous amount of money through the internet, enormous amounts of money. But it is the spectacular performative nature of that protest on the streets of Ottawa that really brought them attention, right? Where they are now reenacting a different kind of Occupy. Right? So we will have to seriously consider, if we're going to really think through all of this, how that very vocabulary of what I'm calling a new architecture of street protest, even as it's being created, is already being in some ways seriously compromised, perhaps, right? And I will end on that note. Thank you.
Vinay, hi. Hi.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Yes, yeah. Um, this is an exciting session. We have got a few questions. Uh, I'll read out the questions so that you can respond. The first is Ajay Singh. Question for Vinay, that is, China's recent imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong has sent something of a chill among descendants, the latest example of which is the arrest just this past week of the 90-year-old Catholic Cardinal Joseph Sen and three other prominent figures. It seems like the draconian law has had the intended effect on the Hong Kong movement, which is ebbing. Uh, what do you think Hong Kongers can do to keep up the momentum? And do you there are inherent limitations to protest in a former colony such as Hong Kong that has been birthed in exploitative capitalism, which from which citizens have generally benefited?
Yes. Yes. An excellent question indeed. The first thing is that when Ajay submits that the draconian law has had, it seems he says that draconian law has had the intended effect on the Hong Kong movement, which is ebbing. Well, I think that yes, the intent was to not simply diminish, but to really pretty much eviscerate the movement. And I think that of the national security law, and I think the national security law indeed has had very much that consequence as I was really describing. And the question, of course, is, well, as he asks, what can be done to keep up the momentum? So I think that the answer to that, really, because I don't have a crystal ball. I suspect no one really does, of course. But in keeping with the tenor of my argument, I think the logical answer is that they will have to continue to show the kind of creativity that they showed. Because the fact that they got this far, think about the umbrella movement, think about the extraordinary uses of the umbrella itself, one of many objects, right? I mean, that's what I was trying to demonstrate, that it shows real creativity. Now, if they continue to show creativity, that may perhaps be one way in which the momentum of the protest can be sustained. But what is behind this question is the question that always arises when we have nonviolent movements. And that is that somebody will come along and ask, as Ajay is doing over here, as Mr. Singh is doing over here, will ask that, what do you do in the face of enormous state power? When there is such extraordinary disequilibrium, because, here you have on the one hand, I mean, you have the PRC, which is a state with extraordinary power. And they have shown repeatedly a willingness to use that power. And of course, this goes back then to the section that I kind of omitted. What prevented China really from undertaking measures that would have stopped the movement back in 2019 itself? So some people thought that, well, China wants to show that it can be a responsible world power. I mean, I'm just giving you one example of the kind of argument. This argument was usually made by the people in the West, which I found a little comical, because the Western states who make that argument have in mind themselves as examples of states which have been responsible in wielding power. What is so responsible about going around bombing countries as the United States have done? Nothing whatsoever, right? So you see, we would have to really think about, what really is behind China's reasons for having withheld itself from having exercised power, right? Back in 2019, until, as I said, the coronavirus pandemic came along, and then the national security law was passed, and essentially pretty much put an end to this movement. So that's one set of questions. And then the second question, really, as I've said, is the question which is the prototype question for this. This is an illustration, because the same thing could be argued for any number of such movements. How should they maintain the momentum when they're crushed, when they're quelled? The other thing I would suggest here is that, look, I mean, it may sound like an idealistic way, but I don't know that we will always be wanting to look at outcomes. The process here is important, right? The fact that these movements are capable of such creativity is, I think, an important advance, and is an important step in what we might describe as the aspiration, the expression of the aspiration for human freedom. All right. The last part of Mr. Singh's question is that, are there not limitations which are intrinsic to the Hong Kong movement, as opposed to, let's say, the CDM, civil disobedience movement in Myanmar, because the people in Hong Kong have they not really benefited from exploitative capitalism, right? Have the citizens of Hong Kong not really benefited from that? And Mr. Singh is absolutely correct and I made that very clear in my remarks, that the socioeconomic strata that we are speaking about in Hong Kong is very different than the socioeconomic strata that we're dealing with in Myanmar. I think, of course, here the question will be that some people may take the view that, well, the Myanmar movement is a more authentic expression of a certain kind of solidarity, more authentic expression of the possibilities of resistance, because those people really do come from the people who have been at the part of the movement, really come from disempowered, disenfranchised, historically discriminated groups, right? Of course, we would have to really do a sociological profile of the protesters there too, because what percentage of these protesters come from privileged backgrounds and How far are they at least part of the dominant Buddhist ethos? I mean, think about the Rohingya, because those are really the disenfranchised, you would say, relative to that. And so therefore, Mr. Singh's question is very important. I'm answering in a different way, because one of the reservations I certainly have about the Myanmar movement, very severe reservation, is that these very people who are in the movement, the vast majority of them did not lift a finger when the Rohingyas were being discriminated against, when they were being driven out of Myanmar itself, right? But this is where I think that, look, I mean, this is the nature of things, that one can sort of be an ideological, strive for a certain kind of ideological purity and look for consistency in everything. And I'm increasingly realizing that this is almost impossible. You're never going to find anyone who fits the bill, someone who seems, or some movement or some group that seems very progressive because they have ideas about class that seem progressive. And then on the issue of gender, they may be completely reactionary, and so forth and so on. So I think that we would have to think of it in those terms to really address the issues that have been raised here by Mr. Singh. I think that's all I have to say on this issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Vinay, there is another question from Enisa Fatima. Protesters that start as essentially non-violent have often turned violent. Theoretically speaking, at what point does this shift take place in terms of the intricate connection between power and violence? Is it always the violence of the state against the protesters that brings about this shift?
Yes. Well, again, I mean, I think a very interesting question, but one that again calls for, I think, a number of different answers, because, see, for example, some scholars would say that we can see that some movements start to turn violent because adherence to non-violence is very demanding, very demanding. Right? I mean, it's like what Freud wrote in Civilization and Its Discontents, that we all incline towards the pleasure principle, but of course, civilization cannot be based on the pleasure principle. There are restraints. The immediate instinct that we have is to thrash the person that we don't agree with, right? To hit the person, to discipline them in some fashion or the other. Non-violence is, in fact, actually one of the most fundamental aspects of that equation of restraint, which makes possible civilization. Freud was not moving in that direction. He was not really talks about non-violence, but I'm using the argument there to suggest one way to think through this, that movements such as non-violent movements may turn violent, and they may turn violent at the point where the demands of non-violence, the rigorous demands, become far too intense for most of the practitioners. That most of the practitioners might simply be adopting non-violence as a matter of policy rather than as a matter of creed or belief, as Gandhi would have argued. That's one set of answers. There's another set of answers, which is very different. Someone who's really looking at realpolitik, or someone who's arguing from a kind of the point of view of a left revolutionary, would say that, well, these movements often will turn violent because the state will put infiltrators into every movement. This is bound to happen, right? And I think that we cannot dismiss this line of reasoning either. There are going to be certainly plenty of instances there. We can even look at, by the way, and I'm now adding a third reason. You look at something like, let's say, BLM, Black Lives Matter. Now, I would submit that if you look seriously at Black Lives Matter, it was a non-violent movement. But what happened? The images that were flashed on the screen were images of people looting, breaking away from a march and then going and attacking stores, robbing them, etc. Those were the images that flashed on the screen. Why? Because in every movement, no matter what kind of movement it is, people will join in for reasons which have nothing to do that are intrinsic to the movement itself. Right? It is bound to be the case. All studies of social movements, political movements, whether non-violent or violent, have shown that to be the case. That people will come into the movement for reasons which are not intrinsic to what the people who had commenced that movement were thinking about, the intrinsic to the objectives of that movement. They come in there for their own selfish reasons. You have a personal grievance. It's like the 1857-58 mutiny. This is what the work has shown. A lot of the people who joined the revolt of 1857-58, they didn't really care what the British were doing or not doing. But if they wanted to target a landlord who had oppressed them, under the cover of the mutiny, they could now do it. You see, right? So this is what I mean when I say I think this question is very important, but there are obviously, I think, many different ways of addressing it. If you were to do it, by some strict theoretical canon, then you would have to see what is that point of tension, right? And that point of tension could be produced by what Marxists used to call false consciousness, that someone who is in a movement is persuaded that his or her interest lies somewhere else, lie with a different ideology, different doctrine, different movement, right? That could be another way to think through this. So I think I've given enough ways to think through the answer to the question that was posed. Biju, are there any further questions? Or is
no more
it?
questions? Especially the last question reminds us of Elias Canetes' book, Mars, a book about Mars and Power. Yeah. And Eric Erikson also written something on the basis of that those questions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We don't have any more questions. So may I invite Mr. M.A. Biju, faculty of the Postgraduate and Research Department of English, for a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Biju sir. Good afternoon, all. We have almost come to the end of the second lecture in the international lecture series, Studies in Dissent and Protest, organized by St. Thomas College, Thrissur, in collaboration with the Kerala State Council Higher Education. Through today's talk on globalizing protest, a new architecture of street dissent, Professor Vinay Lal dissected local avatars of protest and resistance in the streets of Hong Kong and Myanmar as examples of globalizing dissent. Exploring the architecture and semiotics of territoriality, he elaborated how women, along with men, reclaim streets as sites of protest in South Asia. He also discussed post-colonial dimensions of obedience, docility, disobey, and disobedience becoming signifiers in the context of varied mechanisms employed by global digital capitalism. He used the framework provided by Ranajit Guha in his elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India to make his analysis of semiotics of dissent. He has also brought non-violent protest movements into the discussions. On behalf of the management, faculty, and organizing committee, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Vinay Lal for sparing his valuable time to give this wonderful talk. We are eagerly waiting for the further exploration of this topic in your next talk. I thank Dr. C.S. Biju, the organizing committee, the management of the college, and the Kerala State Higher Education Council for arranging this lecture series. Finally, I thank all the audience for their participation, for their questions and observations. Thank you all, and wishing you a good day.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Biju. Thank you, Vinay Lal. And we, we have our beloved manager, Martoni Nilangavil, also was among the participants. Thank you, Father, for your kind presence. Thank you, Vinay. We'll meet on 20th at 11 o'clock for the last of these lectures. Great. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
കഴിയും ചേട്ടാ, കഴിയും. ഇപ്പൊ കഴിയും.